Dear listener, let the world outside your window fall away. Let us journey together, back through the mists of time, to a land of high plateaus and ancient whispers. Our story tonight is one of a great and magnificent empire, the first true world empire in human history. But its story begins not with the clash of great armies or the splendor of golden thrones, but with a quiet and patient movement of people, a slow and steady migration across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, onto the high, sun-drenched plateau that would one day bear their name. This is the story of the Persian Empire, and it begins with a whisper on the wind. Imagine a time, long, long ago, around the year 1000 BCE. The great Bronze Age civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt were already ancient themselves, their history stretching back for millennia. But on the vast, open steppes to the north and east, a new chapter in the human story was beginning. Groups of Indo-Iranian tribes, a people who called themselves the Aryans, or the Noble Ones, began a slow, centuries-long movement southward. They brought with them their language, their customs, and a way of life centered around the horse and the herding of great flocks of sheep and cattle. They were not a single, unified people, but numerous tribal confederations, all of them strong, resilient, and searching for new lands. Their journey was not a sudden invasion, but a gradual, patient migration that unfolded over many generations. And it led them to the great Iranian Plateau, a land of stark and beautiful contrasts. Imagine this landscape as they would have first seen it. To the north, the great Alborz Mountains created a natural, snow-capped barrier along the shores of the Caspian Sea. To the west, the rugged Zagros Mountains formed a formidable wall, separating them from the ancient, fertile plains of Mesopotamia. And between these great mountain ranges lay a high central plateau, a land of extremes, often dry and forbidding, but punctuated by pockets of remarkable fertility, green oases of life amid vast, silent salt deserts. This new and challenging geography would profoundly influence the development of their civilization. It created natural boundaries between their communities, but it also forced them to innovate, to cooperate, and to find new ways to survive and to thrive. The scarcity of water in this arid land taught them the arts of conservation and cooperation. It was here that they developed and perfected the remarkable technology of the Kanat, great, underground aqueducts that could transport water for miles from the mountain aquifers down to their settlements in the dry plains. Imagine these ancient engineers, working with simple tools, digging long, gently sloping tunnels deep beneath the earth, a testament to their patience, their ingenuity, and their refusal to surrender to the limitations of their environment. By the 8th century BCE, two major groups had crystallized from among these migrating peoples, distinguished by their geography and their political organization. In the northwest, in the more fertile and mountainous regions, were the Medes. Their lands were rich in pasture, and they continued their ancient traditions of horse breeding and cavalry warfare. Their towns began to grow, centered around fortified settlements where their tribal leaders established their authority. The greatest of these was Ecbatana, their capital, a magnificent city that, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, was protected by 7 concentric walls, their battlements painted in different colors, with the innermost walls plated in silver and gold. Further south, in the more arid region known as Pars, the land that would eventually give its name to Persia, the Parsa tribe developed their own distinct society. Living in a harsher land, they became masters of dry farming and irrigation. Their settlements were more scattered, built around the precious, reliable sources of water, and they maintained a strong tribal structure, their loyalties focused on their own kinship groups and their local chieftains. For a time, their relative isolation from the great powers of the age allowed them to develop their own unique identity, undisturbed. But these early societies did not develop in a vacuum. To their west lay the powerful and ruthless Neo-Assyrian Empire, perhaps the first true military superpower in history. The Assyrians, with their iron weapons, their professional army, and their brutal, expansionist policies, cast a long, dark shadow over the entire Near East. Their own ancient records contain the earliest written mentions of the Medes and the Persians, typically describing them as targets of military campaigns or as reluctant payers of tribute. This constant threat from the west forced the previously independent tribes to consider greater cooperation, to unite in the face of a common enemy. The Medes, being closer to the Assyrian border, felt this pressure most acutely. And under a series of capable leaders, they began to transform themselves from a loose confederation of tribes into a formidable kingdom. In the late 7th century BCE, the opportunity for true independence finally arrived. The great Assyrian Empire, weakened by internal strife, began to crumble. The Medes, under their great king Cyaxares, seized the moment. They formed an alliance with the Babylonians, and in the year 612 BCE, this alliance achieved what had once seemed impossible. They captured and sacked the great city of Nineveh, the mighty capital of the Assyrian Empire. The fall of Nineveh reverberated throughout the ancient world. It marked the end of Assyrian dominance and announced the arrival of a new power on the international stage. The Median Empire was born. It claimed the northern portions of the old Assyrian realm, its rule now extending from the Iranian Plateau across northern Mesopotamia and into eastern Anatolia. And under this new Median hegemony, the Parsa tribe to the south remained as subordinate allies or vassals, maintaining their local authority but acknowledging the overlordship of their Median kinsmen. The Median Empire, though it would prove to be short-lived, established important precedents for the future. It demonstrated that the peoples of the Iranian Plateau could not only resist the ancient powers of Mesopotamia but could create a powerful and sophisticated imperial system of their own. They adopted and adapted elements of Mesopotamian art and administration while still maintaining their own distinct cultural traits. Their great capital at Ecbatana became renowned for its splendor, a worthy rival to the great cities of Babylon and Susa. The foundations had been laid. A strong military tradition, a growing experience in governance, and a rich and evolving cultural identity were now all in place. All that was needed now was a new, visionary leader, a leader who would emerge not from the heart of the Median Empire, but from its quiet, southern periphery, a young prince from the Parsa tribe, a man named Cyrus. He would take these foundations and build upon them an empire of unprecedented scale and vision, an empire that would change the world forever. But in these early days, as the Medes ruled from their mountain strongholds, this imperial future remained an unwritten story, a quiet whisper carried on the winds that swept across the great, high plateau. As the early peoples of the Iranian Plateau established their lives, their spiritual world was a reflection of the ancient traditions they had carried with them from the Great Steppes. It was a world populated by many gods, a polytheistic faith where ritual sacrifices were made to appease the various powers that governed the natural world. But amid these ancient practices, during this formative period, a profound spiritual revolution was beginning to take shape, a transformation sparked by the visions of a single, remarkable prophet named Zarathustra, known to the Greek world as Zoroaster. The exact time when he lived is a mystery, a detail lost to the deep mists of history, but the power of his teachings would prove to be timeless, creating one of the world's oldest and most influential continuously practiced faiths. Imagine Zarathustra now, not as a king or a warrior, but as a quiet, contemplative man, a priest who wandered the high, lonely places of the plateau, his heart troubled by the world around him, his soul searching for a deeper truth. It was during one of these solitary meditations that he received his divine revelation. As he stood by a river at dawn, a great, shining being appeared before him, a being of pure, radiant light, who led him into the presence of the one, true, supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. In this moment of profound, divine communion, Zarathustra was given a new and revolutionary vision of the cosmos. He came to understand that the universe was not a chaotic pantheon of competing gods, but the stage for a great and epic struggle between two fundamental, primordial spirits. On one side was Ahura Mazda himself, the uncreated god of light, of wisdom, of order, and of truth, which was called Asha. And in opposition to him was Engra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the embodiment of darkness, of ignorance, of chaos, and of falsehood, which was called Druj. All of existence, Zarathustra taught, was caught in this immense, cosmic battle between these two opposing forces. This was a profound dualism, but the most revolutionary aspect of Zarathustra's teaching was the role that humanity played in this cosmic drama. Humans, he preached, were not merely passive pawns of the gods, their fates determined by divine whim. Instead, every single human being was an active participant in this great struggle. Through their own free will, through their every thought, their every word, and their every deed, they had the power to align themselves with either the forces of truth or the forces of falsehood, to either strengthen the cosmic order or to contribute to the forces of chaos. The path to righteousness, he taught, was simple, yet profound. It was the threefold path of Hamata, Hukta, Varshta, good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. This emphasis on individual moral choice and personal responsibility was a transformative idea that empowered the individual as never before. The Prophet's teachings were preserved in a series of 17 beautiful and profound hymns known as the Gathas, which form the oldest part of the Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism. These ancient poems reveal a sophisticated theological system that grappled with the deepest questions of existence, the nature of the divine, the purpose of human life, and the eternal conflict between good and evil. His teachings also held a deep reverence for the natural world, seeing the elements themselves as pure manifestations of Ahura Mazda's creation. Fire, in particular, became a central symbol of the faith, its pure, upward-leaping flame representing the light, the warmth, and the truth of the wise Lord. The spread of these new ideas among the tribes of the Iranian Plateau was a slow and gradual process. But the faith's emphasis on truth, on ethical behavior, and on a single, just, and ordered cosmos resonated deeply with the cultural values that were already developing across the plateau. And crucially, this new spiritual framework also shaped the concepts of kingship and governance. A righteous ruler was no longer simply the strongest warrior or the most powerful chieftain. A righteous king was one who embodied and defended Asha, the divine truth and order, one who fought against the forces of Druj, the lie and the chaos. This ideological foundation, this belief in a ruler's sacred duty to uphold a moral and cosmic order, would later help to legitimize the imperial rule of the Achaemenid kings. It provided a powerful spiritual framework for a new kind of empire, an empire that would be built not just on conquest, but on a vision of universal justice. As the Medes established their own kingdom, and as the Persians in the south began to consolidate their power, these quiet, ancient whispers of the prophet Zarathustra were already shaping the soul of a civilization, preparing the way for a new kind of leader, a king who would see himself not just as a conqueror, but as an agent of the wise Lord, a shepherd for his people, and a bringer of order to a chaotic world. As the 6th century before the Common Era dawned upon the great Iranian plateau, few could have predicted that a prince from a subordinate, southern tribe would soon create the largest and most revolutionary empire the world had yet seen. The stage for this remarkable transformation was set during the latter years of Median dominance. The Median Empire, from its magnificent, mountain-ringed capital at Ecbatana, was at the height of its power. Its king, Astyages, grandson of the great Cyaxares who had helped to topple the mighty Assyrian Empire, now ruled a vast domain. His authority was absolute, his wealth legendary. But in the quiet halls of his palace, the seeds of a great and terrible fear were about to be planted in his heart, a fear that would grow from a simple dream and would ultimately lead to the very downfall he so desperately sought to avoid. The details of the future conqueror's early life are shrouded in the beautiful, shimmering mists of legend, told most famously by the great Greek historian, Herodotus. Imagine the scene. King Astyages, the mighty ruler of the Medes, is asleep in his grand, cedar-paneled bedchamber. And in his sleep, a strange and powerful vision comes to him. He dreams that his daughter, Mandane, gives birth not to a child, but to a great and mighty vine. This vine grows with a supernatural speed, its tendrils reaching out, wrapping themselves around the city of Ecbatana, then around the entire Median kingdom, and finally, stretching out to cover all of Asia. The king awoke in a cold sweat, the vision still burning in his mind. He summoned his wise men, the Magi, the priestly class who were the interpreters of dreams and omens. They listened to the king's dream with grave faces, and their interpretation was unanimous and chilling. The dream meant that his daughter's son would one day rise up and overthrow him, taking his kingdom for himself. Fear, cold and sharp, took root in the king's heart. He was determined to thwart this prophecy. He arranged for his daughter, Mandane, to be married not to a powerful Median noble, but to a man he considered to be of a lesser station, a Persian nobleman named Cambyses, from the southern land of Pars. He believed that a child born of such a union would never be powerful enough to challenge his throne. But a year later, the news he had dreaded arrived. Mandane had given birth to a son. Astyages, his fear now a raging fire, summoned his most trusted courtier, a man named Harpagus. He ordered Harpagus to take the infant, to carry him out into the wild mountains, and to leave him there to die. Harpagus, though a loyal servant, was a man with a conscience. He took the small, innocent child, wrapped in royal swaddling clothes, but he could not bring himself to commit such a heartless act. Instead, he sought out one of the king's royal herdsmen, a man named Mithridates, whose own wife had just given birth to a stillborn child. Harpagus explained the king's terrible command, and he proposed a trade. The shepherd and his wife would take the royal infant and raise him as their own, and they would give their own stillborn child to Harpagus, to be dressed in the royal clothes and left on the mountainside. The shepherd, fearing the king's wrath but moved by pity, agreed. And so, the prophecy was unknowingly set on its course. The infant prince, whose name was Cyrus, was raised not in the splendor of a palace, but in the humble, rustic world of a mountain shepherd. For 10 years, the secret was kept. Cyrus grew into a strong and charismatic boy. He learned the ways of the mountains, the language of the animals, and the hard, simple virtues of a shepherd's life. But his royal blood, his innate capacity for leadership, could not be entirely suppressed. One day, while playing with the other village boys, they decided to play a game of king. And by a strange twist of fate, or perhaps by the force of his own natural charisma, Cyrus was chosen to be the king. He took to the role with a surprising seriousness, issuing commands to his courtiers and his guards. But one of the boys, the son of a prominent nobleman, refused to obey the orders of a simple shepherd's son. Cyrus, in his role as king, had the boy seized and, as punishment for his disobedience, had him whipped. The nobleman, enraged that his son had been beaten by a commoner, complained directly to King Astyages himself. The king, amused by this tale of a childhood quarrel, summoned both Cyrus and his shepherd foster-father to the palace. But when the boy stood before him, the king was struck by a sudden, chilling sense of recognition. There was something in the boy's bearing, in the proud and fearless look in his eyes, that seemed strangely familiar. He saw in the face of this shepherd boy the echo of his own daughter, Mandane. He questioned the shepherd, who, under the threat of torture, finally confessed the entire story of the child's true origins. Astyages was filled with a mixture of relief and rage. He was relieved that his grandson was alive, but he was furious at Harpagus for his disobedience. He concealed his anger, however, and in a terrible act of cruelty, he invited Harpagus to a royal banquet. At the feast, he served the courtier a special dish. Only after Harpagus had eaten did the king reveal the horrifying truth: he had just consumed the flesh of his own murdered son. This monstrous act of revenge would have its own terrible consequences, for Harpagus's hatred for the king now burned with a cold, patient, and all-consuming fire. As for Cyrus, the king, having consulted with his magi once more, was persuaded that the prophecy had already been fulfilled in a harmless, symbolic way. The boy had been king in a children's game. And so, he allowed Cyrus to be sent to his true parents in Pars. It was in Pars, his ancestral homeland, that the young prince, now aware of his true identity and his prophesied destiny, began to consolidate his power. He was a man who combined the royal bearing of his birth with the hard-won wisdom of his rustic upbringing. He united the scattered Persian tribes under his leadership, his charisma and his reputation for justice winning him the loyalty of his people. The opportunity for a greater destiny came, as it so often does, from an act of betrayal. Harpagus, the Median courtier whose heart was still filled with a cold and patient hatred for the king who had murdered his son, sent a secret message to Cyrus. He urged the young Persian prince to lead his people in a rebellion against Median rule, promising that he and other discontented Median nobles would defect to his side when the time was right. Sensing his moment had arrived, Cyrus marched his Persian forces against his grandfather, the mighty King Astyages. The armies met, and as Harpagus had promised, a significant portion of the Median army, disillusioned with their tyrannical king, turned against him. The Median Empire, which had seemed so powerful, crumbled from within. Astyages was captured. But here, at the very moment of his triumph, Cyrus displayed the remarkable and revolutionary character that would define his entire reign. He did not execute his grandfather, as was the common practice of the age. Instead, he treated the defeated king with respect and honor, allowing him to live out his days in comfort at the royal court. Cyrus portrayed himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the Median throne, a unifier of the two kindred Iranian peoples. He incorporated Median nobles into his own new government, transforming former enemies into loyal partners. In this single, compassionate, and politically brilliant act, the young prince from Pars laid the foundation for a new kind of empire, an empire built not just on the raw power of conquest, but on the surprising and enduring strength of tolerance, of integration, and of a vision that could see a shared future where others saw only the bitter divisions of the past. The rise of Cyrus was complete. The age of Persia had begun. With the union of the Medes and the Persians now secure under his wise and benevolent rule, Cyrus the Great turned his gaze westward, toward the ancient and fabulously wealthy kingdoms of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. The world he looked upon was a complex tapestry of old empires and rising powers, a world accustomed to a single, brutal, and unchanging rule of conquest. The victor plundered the vanquished, destroyed their cities, desecrated their temples, and led their people away into slavery or exile. This was the ancient and terrible logic of empire, a logic that had been practiced for millennia. But Cyrus, the shepherd prince from Pars, was about to introduce a new and revolutionary chapter into this long and bloody history. He would be a conqueror, yes, but a conqueror of a kind the world had never seen before. His first great challenge came from the west, from the powerful and immensely wealthy kingdom of Lydia, located in modern-day western Turkey. Lydia was ruled by King Croesus, a man whose name had become synonymous with wealth itself. His capital city of Sardis was a wonder of the ancient world, and his kingdom controlled the rich trade routes that connected the Greek world of the Aegean with the heart of Anatolia. Croesus, watching the sudden and dramatic rise of this new Persian power to his east, grew deeply concerned. He decided to consult the most famous and most respected oracle in the ancient world, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, to determine whether he should launch a preemptive strike against the upstart Persian king. The Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, gave him a famously ambiguous answer. "If you cross the Halys River," she declared, referring to the river that formed the border between their two kingdoms, "you will destroy a great empire." Croesus, in his pride and his confidence, interpreted this prophecy in the most favorable light possible. He believed it meant that he was destined to destroy the new Persian Empire. And so, he led his powerful Lydian army, with its famed cavalry, across the river and into Persian territory. The two armies met in a great and indecisive battle. But as winter approached, Croesus, following the traditional rules of ancient warfare, decided to withdraw his army back to his capital at Sardis, intending to resume the campaign in the spring. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that Cyrus would follow the same traditional rules. But Cyrus was a new kind of leader, a man who wrote his own rules. Instead of retreating for the winter, he did the unthinkable. He led his army on a forced march, following the retreating Lydian forces with incredible speed, and he appeared before the walls of Sardis, taking the Lydian king completely by surprise. The city was captured, and King Croesus was taken prisoner. As the defeated king stood before him, ready to meet the traditional fate of a vanquished monarch, Cyrus once again demonstrated his revolutionary character. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Croesus was placed upon a great funeral pyre, ready to be burned alive. But as the flames began to lick at the edges of the pyre, Croesus cried out the name of Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver who had once warned him that no man could be called truly happy until he had seen the end of his life. Cyrus, hearing this, was struck by a profound sense of empathy. He saw in the fate of the Lydian king a reflection of the fragility of all human fortune, including his own. He ordered the flames to be extinguished, and he spared Croesus's life. He not only saved him from the pyre, but he gave him an honored place at his own royal court, where the former king would become one of his most trusted and wisest advisors. This act of mercy, of seeing a shared humanity in a defeated foe, was a concept so foreign to the brutal geopolitics of the age that it sent a shockwave of disbelief and wonder throughout the ancient world. With the conquest of Lydia, the Persian Empire now extended to the shores of the Aegean Sea, bringing it into direct contact with the Greek city-states of Ionia. But Cyrus's greatest and most legendary conquest was yet to come. He now turned his attention to the south, to the ancient and magnificent city of Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, the last great superpower of the Old World. The city of Babylon, under its king, Nabonidus, was not just a military power, it was the cultural and religious heart of the ancient Near East. Its walls were said to be so thick that 2 chariots could race abreast upon their tops. Its great ziggurat, the temple of its chief god, Marduk, reached toward the heavens. And within its walls lived a large and ancient community of Jewish exiles, the people of Judah who had been forcibly deported from their homeland decades earlier by the great Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. Cyrus approached the great city not with the brute force of a typical conqueror, but with the subtle genius of a liberator. For years before his military campaign, he engaged in a brilliant and sophisticated campaign of propaganda. He portrayed himself not as a foreign invader, but as a restorer of tradition, a righteous ruler chosen by Babylon's own god, Marduk, to free the city from the rule of its own unpopular king, Nabonidus, who had neglected the traditional cults in favor of his own preferred deity. This message resonated deeply with the powerful and discontented priesthood of Marduk within the city. When the Persian army finally arrived at the walls of Babylon in the year 539 BCE, the city fell without a fight. The gates were opened from within, and Cyrus entered the great metropolis not as a destroyer, but as a savior. He was welcomed by the people as a liberator. And once again, he demonstrated his unique and revolutionary approach to governance. He did not desecrate the temples. Instead, he personally participated in the religious ceremonies of Marduk, showing his profound respect for the local traditions. He did not plunder the city's great wealth. And most remarkably of all, he issued a decree that would echo through all of history. He declared that all the captive peoples who had been held in Babylon, including the Jewish exiles, were free to return to their homelands, to rebuild their temples, and to worship their own gods in peace. This act, recorded in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with his decree, was a landmark in the history of human rights and religious tolerance. It was a policy born not just of a benevolent heart, but of a profound and practical political wisdom. Cyrus understood that a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire could not be held together by force alone. It required the loyalty and the willing cooperation of its diverse peoples. And that loyalty could be won not by suppressing their cultures, but by respecting and even protecting them. The Uncommon Conqueror had once again achieved the impossible. He had conquered the world's greatest city without shedding a drop of blood. He had transformed a subjugated people into grateful allies. And he had established a principle of governance that would become the very foundation of his new and revolutionary Persian Empire, an empire that was beginning to look less like a collection of conquered lands, and more like a commonwealth of nations, a world united not just by the power of a single king, but by the surprising and enduring strength of his tolerance. With the fall of Babylon, a great and profound quiet settled over the ancient world. The city that had for so long been the very center of civilization, the great, beating heart of Mesopotamia, had been taken without a battle, without a siege, without the terrible, familiar screams of the vanquished. A new kind of power had arrived on the world stage, a power that did not announce itself with fire and slaughter, but with a strange and unsettling magnanimity. Cyrus the Great, the king from Pars, was now the undisputed master of the known world. He was the ruler of a realm that stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the great mountains of the Hindu Kush, an empire of unprecedented scale and diversity. But the great challenge he now faced was not one of conquest, but of governance. How could one man possibly rule over so many different peoples, with their different gods, their different languages, and their different ways of life? The empires that had come before him, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, had ruled through terror and forced assimilation. Cyrus would choose a different path. His first act upon entering the great city of Babylon was not to tear down, but to rebuild. He did not desecrate the city's great temples. Instead, he, the follower of the wise Lord Ahura Mazda, personally participated in the sacred religious ceremonies of Babylon's chief god, Marduk. Imagine the scene: the Persian king, the conqueror, standing in the vast, incense-filled courtyard of the Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, his head bowed in respect before the powerful Babylonian priests. This was more than just a political gesture, it was a profound statement of his imperial philosophy. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror imposing his own beliefs, but as a righteous ruler, chosen by Marduk himself to restore the proper order and to honor the ancient traditions of the land. And then, he issued a decree, an edict so revolutionary, so contrary to all the established practices of the age, that it would echo through all of history. This decree, preserved for all time on a small clay cylinder, now known as the Cyrus Cylinder, was a testament to his unique and enlightened vision of empire. It was not a declaration of power, but a promise of freedom. In this remarkable document, Cyrus describes how he returned the sacred statues of the gods that had been taken from other cities and brought to Babylon by previous kings, allowing them to be restored to their own temples. He speaks of how he gathered all the former inhabitants of these cities, all the peoples who had been forcibly deported and held as captives in Babylon, and he permitted them to return to their homelands. Among these displaced peoples were the Jews of Judah, who had been living in exile in Babylon for nearly 50 years, ever since their own holy city of Jerusalem had been destroyed by the great Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. Imagine their disbelief, their cautious, fragile hope, as the news of the Persian king's decree spread through their community. For 2 generations, they had mourned by the rivers of Babylon, dreaming of their lost homeland. And now, this foreign king, this conqueror from the east, was offering them not just freedom, but his active support. The Hebrew Bible praises Cyrus as a Messiah, as God's own anointed one, the ruler who not only permitted the Jews to return to Judah, but who provided them with the resources and the imperial protection to rebuild their sacred temple in Jerusalem. This extraordinary act was not special treatment for the Jews alone, but part of a broader, revolutionary policy applied to all the diverse peoples within his new realm. The genius of the Achaemenid imperial system, as established by its founder, Cyrus, lay in this delicate and brilliant balance between a strong central authority and a profound respect for local autonomy. The empire was divided into great provinces, or satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a title that meant, protector of the kingdom. These provincial governors, who were typically trusted Persian or Median nobles, were responsible for collecting taxes, for maintaining order, and for representing the king's authority in their distant lands. But within this overarching imperial framework, the local peoples were, for the most part, allowed to live their lives according to their own traditions. Their local laws, their languages, their religious practices, their cultural customs, all were generally respected. So long as a province remained peaceful, paid its assigned tribute, and did not rebel against the authority of the great king, its people were free to be themselves. This was a model of empire built not on the fragile foundation of fear, but on the enduring strength of loyalty. It was a system that sought to create not just subjects, but willing participants, stakeholders in the peace and prosperity of the empire. Cyrus understood a profound truth that so many other conquerors had failed to grasp, that an empire that accommodated diversity, that respected the dignity of its peoples, was far more stable, and ultimately far more powerful, than one that sought to impose a single, rigid, and uniform culture upon all. To bind this vast and diverse realm together, Cyrus and his successors established a remarkable infrastructure. The most famous of these was the Great Royal Road, a highway that stretched for over 1,500 miles, from the city of Susa in the Persian heartland all the way to the city of Sardis on the Aegean coast. Imagine this road, a well-maintained artery of communication and commerce, with regularly spaced rest stations and mounted couriers who could carry messages across the entire empire in a matter of days. This system, a kind of continental pony express, allowed the great king to maintain control over his distant provinces and to respond quickly to any challenges to his authority. But it was more than just a tool of governance, it was a symbol of the new, connected world that Cyrus was building. The great king established his own capital at Pasargadae, in his native Pars, a beautiful city of palaces and magnificent gardens. But the architecture of his new capital was not narrowly Persian. It was a deliberate and beautiful synthesis of styles from all the different cultures that were now united under his rule, a physical embodiment of the inclusive and cosmopolitan nature of his new empire. In the final years of his reign, the visionary founder of the empire continued to consolidate his vast realm. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed, with some ancient historians claiming he died peacefully in his palace, and others telling a more romantic, tragic tale of his fall in a battle against a nomadic queen on the empire's remote northeastern frontier. But whatever the manner of his death, his tomb still stands to this day near his old capital, a simple, noble, gabled stone chamber, a testament to the man who preferred the title of father and liberator to that of conqueror and master. His legacy was a realm that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus, from the Caucasus to the Arabian Sea, the largest and most diverse political entity the world had yet seen. But more importantly, he had established a new and revolutionary model of imperial rule, a model based on the surprising and enduring power of tolerance, of inclusion, and of respect for the diverse cultures and faiths of all the peoples who now lived under the protection of his law. He was truly the king of the four quarters of the world, a king whose enlightened vision would continue to influence and inspire all the great empires that were to come. When the great founder of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus, departed from the world around 530 before the Common Era, his eldest son, Cambyses II, ascended to the throne of the King of Kings. The transition of power proceeded with a remarkable smoothness, a testament to the stability of the imperial system that his father had so carefully established. Cambyses was not a newcomer to the arts of governance. He had already served as the regent of Babylon during his father's long eastern campaigns, gaining valuable administrative experience in one of the empire's most important and complex provinces. Now, as the sole ruler of the vast domain stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush, the son of Cyrus faced the immense challenge of proving himself a worthy successor to his legendary father's inheritance. His first challenge came not from a foreign power, but from within his own family. His younger brother, Bardia, known to the Greeks as Smerdes, governed the great eastern provinces of the empire. Though the precise nature of the challenge remains shrouded in the conflicting accounts of history, it appears that the new king swiftly and ruthlessly neutralized any potential threat to his authority, securing his position on the throne. With his domestic power now secure, the heir of Cyrus turned his gaze toward the one great, ancient civilization that remained independent on the fringes of his empire, the one great prize that had eluded even his father's grasp, the ancient, mysterious, and fabulously wealthy land of Egypt. For nearly 3 millennia, Egypt had dominated the fertile valley of the Nile. Its civilization was ancient when the Persians were still migrating onto the Iranian Plateau. Now, it stood as the last independent kingdom of note in the region, a land of powerful pharaohs, enigmatic gods, and immense wealth. To conquer Egypt would be to complete his father's work, to bring the entirety of the known civilized world under Achaemenid control. And so, Cambyses began his preparations for what would become the defining, and ultimately the most tragic, campaign of his reign. The Egyptian pharaoh of the time, Amasis, who had ruled for over 40 long and prosperous years, was well aware of the looming threat from the east. He was a shrewd and capable ruler, and he began to strengthen Egypt's defenses. He sought alliances with the powerful Greek city-states, particularly Cyprus and the great naval power of Samos, hoping to use their fleets to counter the Achaemenid naval advantage. But fate, it seemed, favored the son of Cyrus. In the year 526 BCE, the long and stable reign of Amasis came to an end. The old pharaoh died, leaving the throne to his son, Psamtik III, a young and untested ruler who now had to face the greatest military threat his nation had seen in generations. The timing for the Persian invasion could not have been more perfect. The Great Invasion began in the spring of 525 BCE. The Achaemenid army, a vast and multi-ethnic force, marched westward along the Mediterranean coast. And alongside them, a great fleet, comprising ships from the conquered lands of Phoenicia, Ionia, and Cyprus, sailed in support, carrying supplies and providing naval superiority. A crucial alliance with a man named Phans of Halicarnassus, a former Greek mercenary commander who had served the Egyptians and had now defected to the Persian side, provided Cambyses with invaluable intelligence about the Egyptian defenses and the difficult terrain that lay ahead. One major obstacle stood between the invading army and the fertile lands of the Nile Delta, the great, waterless expanse of the Sinai Desert. Here, Cambyses displayed the same logistical brilliance that had characterized his father's campaigns. According to the historian Herodotus, he made a pact with the local Arab tribes, who helped his massive army navigate this harsh and unforgiving terrain by supplying them with water, carried in thousands of animal skin containers on the backs of camels. Upon reaching the eastern branch of the Nile, the Persian army finally encountered the Egyptian forces, near the fortified city of Pelusium. Despite their determination and their advantage of fighting on their home ground, the army of the young pharaoh Psamtik III could not withstand the disciplined and battle-hardened Persian assault. After a fierce battle, the Egyptian lines broke, and the survivors retreated toward the ancient capital city of Memphis. Following this decisive victory, Cambyses pressed deeper into the delta, eventually reaching Memphis itself. After a brief siege, the great city fell, and the pharaoh, Psamtik III, was captured. Initially, the captured king was treated with the respect that Persian custom typically afforded to defeated monarchs. However, when evidence later emerged that the pharaoh was involved in a secret plot to raise a rebellion, the conqueror ordered his execution. With the fall of Memphis in 525 BCE, the ancient and independent kingdom of Egypt became a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire. The victory was a monumental one. It was not just a military conquest, but the absorption of the world's oldest continuing civilization into the newest and largest empire. The land of the pharaohs, with its 3,000 years of recorded history, now answered to a throne in distant Persia. But Cambyses was not content with merely conquering Egypt. He sought to rule it. He adopted the full, elaborate titles and the sacred regalia of a traditional Egyptian pharaoh, presenting himself to his new subjects not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the ancient line of kings. In the Egyptian records of the time, he appears not as Cambyses, but with a proper pharaonic titular, as Mesut-Re, the offspring of Ra. Temple inscriptions from his reign show him kneeling in the traditional pose of an Egyptian king, making offerings to the ancient gods of the Nile, to Ammonius, to Horus, and to Osiris. This remarkable cultural flexibility, this willingness to adapt to the local traditions of kingship, was a direct continuation of the wise imperial philosophy that his father, Cyrus, had established. But this is not the only story that has come down to us. The Greek historians, particularly Herodotus, paint a very different picture of Cambyses's time in Egypt. They portray him as a madman, a tyrant prone to irrational outbursts of cruelty and sacrilege. They tell stories of him mocking the Egyptian religious customs, of desecrating royal tombs, and most famously, of him, in a fit of rage, killing the sacred Apis bull, a creature that was believed to be the living incarnation of the god Ptah. These tales have colored his historical reputation for millennia, earning him a place among history's mad monarchs. But modern historians and archaeologists take a more nuanced view. The stories of his madness may well have been exaggerated, or even fabricated, perhaps reflecting a later Egyptian resentment of Persian rule, a kind of propaganda designed to delegitimize the conqueror. Archaeological evidence, in fact, seems to contradict some of the most famous of these tales. Records have been found of the proper and respectful burial of an Apis bull during his reign, an event that Cambyses himself seems to have supported and participated in. And while his rule may have been harsher than his father's, it is clear that he also understood the practical necessity of supporting the powerful temple establishments that were the backbone of Egyptian society and administration. With Egypt now secured, the king's ambition stretched even further. He planned expeditions against the great city of Carthage to the west, and into the mysterious lands of Ethiopia to the south. But here, he met the limits of his power. The campaign against Carthage had to be abandoned when his Phoenician fleet, the very backbone of Achaemenid naval power, refused to attack their own kinsmen, the colony of Carthage which had been founded by Phoenicians centuries before. They would serve the great king against any other enemy, but not against their own people. The southern expedition into Nubia, modern-day Sudan, achieved some success, extending Persian influence beyond the first cataract of the Nile. But an attempted march across the vast desert to attack the remote oasis of Siwa ended in a terrible and mysterious disaster, when a massive sandstorm, according to Herodotus, completely buried an entire army of thousands of soldiers. After nearly 3 years in Egypt, the need to address matters in the heart of the empire drew the monarch back toward the east. And it was during this long return journey that the most dramatic and mysterious episode of his reign unfolded, a crisis that would threaten the very existence of the empire he had just expanded. News arrived, carried by swift messengers, that a man claiming to be his own brother, Bardia, the man he had secretly eliminated years before, had seized the Persian throne in his absence. Whether this was the real Bardia, who had somehow survived, or a clever impostor, a Magian priest named Gaumata, as later official histories would claim, remains one of history's great, unresolved questions. Regardless of his true identity, this usurper had gained substantial support throughout the empire, particularly by promising a 3-year holiday from all taxes and military service. The sudden revelation of this rebellion seems to have had a devastating effect on Cambyses. While racing back toward the imperial heartland to reclaim his throne, the king died. The circumstances of his death are as mysterious as much of his life. Herodotus claims that he accidentally wounded himself with his own dagger while mounting his horse, the wound becoming infected and proving fatal. Other traditions suggest he died at Damascus, perhaps by his own hand, in a moment of despair. The timing could not have been worse for the stability of the empire. With no clear heir to inherit the throne, and with a mysterious usurper now in control of the capital, the great Achaemenid Empire, less than a decade after the death of its founder, now faced its first major succession crisis, a crisis that threatened to unravel all that had been achieved, and to plunge the known world back into chaos. The great Achaemenid Empire, less than a decade after the death of its visionary founder, now teetered on the brink of chaos. Its king, Cambyses, was dead. And on the throne in the heart of the empire sat a mysterious figure, a man who called himself Bardia, the brother of Cambyses, but whom many suspected was a clever impostor, a Magian priest named Gaumata. This usurper, by promising a 3-year remission of all taxes and military service, had won the support of many of the common people throughout the vast and diverse provinces. The great Persian nobility, the very backbone of the empire, now found themselves in a perilous position. To support the usurper would be to betray the Achaemenid dynasty. But to oppose him, when his popular support was so strong, was to risk their own lives and fortunes. The empire held its breath, waiting for someone to act. It was in this moment of profound crisis, in the year 522 before the Common Era, that a young man named Darius, a member of a collateral branch of the Achaemenid royal family, decided that his destiny had arrived. He was a man of immense ambition, of sharp intelligence, and of a deep and abiding belief in the principles of order and truth that had been laid down by the prophet Zarathustra. He saw in the rule of this usurper not just a political crisis, but a spiritual one. The man on the throne represented the Druj, the lie, and it was his sacred duty, as a nobleman and a follower of Ahura Mazda, to restore Asha, the truth. Darius was not alone in his conviction. He sought out 6 other prominent Persian nobles, men who shared his loyalty to the Achaemenid house and his suspicion of the man on the throne. Imagine them now, these 7 conspirators, meeting in secret, in the dead of night, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, their voices low and urgent whispers. They were Otanes, Gobrias, Intaphrines, Megabyzus, Hydarnes, and Aspathenes. Each was a powerful man in his own right, the head of a great noble house. And in this secret council, they forged a pact, a sacred oath sealed by the mixing of their own blood, to overthrow the false king and to restore the rightful order of the empire. Their plan was one of audacious, almost suicidal, bravery. The usurper, Gaumata, was residing in a fortress in Media. The 7 conspirators, with a small retinue of their most trusted guards, rode to the fortress. They bluffed their way past the outer guards, their high rank and their confident bearing allowing them to penetrate the fortress's defenses. They reached the inner chambers, where they were confronted by the palace eunuchs, the personal attendants of the king. A brief, vicious struggle ensued in the narrow corridors. But the conspirators fought with the fury of men who knew there was no turning back. They cut their way through the guards and burst into the royal bedchamber. There, they found him, the man who called himself Bardia. A desperate, final struggle took place in the darkened room. And in the chaos, Darius himself, with the help of his comrades, struck the final, fatal blow, killing the man who had, for a few short months, held the fate of the world's greatest empire in his hands. The lie had been defeated. But the question of who would now represent the truth remained. According to the tale told by Herodotus, after the assassination, the 7 conspirators, their task complete, gathered to decide on the future governance of the empire. A remarkable debate took place. Otanes, the first to voice his suspicions about the usurper, argued for the establishment of a democracy, a radical idea in an age of absolute monarchy. Megabyzus argued for an oligarchy, a state ruled by a council of the best and wisest nobles. But it was Darius who made the most forceful and ultimately the most persuasive case for the restoration of the monarchy. A single, strong, and virtuous ruler, he argued, was the only form of government that could effectively hold together such a vast and diverse empire. His arguments won the day. The conspirators agreed that one of them would be king. And they decided to leave the choice, once again, to the will of the gods, through a sign. They agreed that they would all ride out on their horses at dawn, and the man whose horse was the first to neigh after the sun had risen would be acclaimed as the new king of kings. Here, the story takes a turn into the realm of clever, and perhaps apocryphal, legend. Darius, so the story goes, had a clever groom named Obears. On the night before the contest, Obears took Darius's stallion and led it to a mare that was in heat, allowing the stallion to cover her. The next morning, as the 7 nobles rode out to the appointed spot, Obears waited. Just as the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, he brought the same mare out and led her past the waiting horsemen. Darius's stallion, catching the familiar scent of the mare, immediately let out a loud and triumphant neigh. At that very moment, a clap of thunder and a flash of lightning split the clear morning sky, a sign that the gods themselves had confirmed the choice. The other 6 nobles immediately dismounted, and they knelt before Darius, hailing him as their new king. But Darius's ascension to the throne was not the end of the crisis, it was the beginning of a new and even more violent chapter. The assassination of the man who called himself Bardia had created a power vacuum, and the news of Darius's seizure of power, a man from a junior branch of the royal family, was not universally accepted. The great empire, which had been held together by the immense prestige of Cyrus and the power of his son, now erupted in a firestorm of rebellion. From Egypt to the Indus, from the shores of the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, province after province rose up in revolt, each led by a local leader who now saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. The first year of Darius's reign was a year of constant, brutal, and relentless warfare. He was not a king sitting on a throne, he was a general living in the saddle. Imagine him now, a man in his late 20s, crisscrossing his vast, rebellious empire with a corps of loyal Persian and Median troops, his energy and his determination seemingly limitless. He marched first to Babylon, where a new rebel king had been proclaimed. After a fierce siege, he retook the great city, and this time, there was no mercy. The rebel leader was executed, and the city's great walls were partially dismantled to prevent future uprisings. He then turned east, to Elam, to Media, to Parthia, to Armenia, crushing one rebellion after another with a ruthless efficiency. In a single year, he fought 19 major battles and defeated 9 different rebel kings. Darius himself was keenly aware of the precariousness of his position and the need to legitimize his rule. And so, he commissioned one of the most remarkable and enduring monuments of the ancient world, the great rock face inscription at Behistun. High on a limestone cliff, overlooking the ancient road that connected Babylon with Ecbatana, he had his story carved into the stone, in 3 different languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The great relief sculpture shows Darius, his foot planted on the chest of the defeated usurper, Gaumata, while a line of the 9 defeated rebel kings stands before him, their hands bound, a rope around their necks. And above them all hovers the winged symbol of the great god, Ahura Mazda, who extends a hand in a gesture of divine blessing. The text that accompanies this great sculpture is Darius's own version of the events, his official history. In it, he portrays himself not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir, chosen by Ahura Mazda to restore order to a world that had been plunged into chaos by the lie. "I am Darius," the inscription proclaims, "the great king, king of kings, the king of Persia, the king of countries. By the grace of Ahura Mazda I am king, Ahura Mazda bestowed the kingdom upon me." He meticulously lists all the rebellions he crushed, framing his military campaigns not as acts of conquest, but as a great and righteous struggle to defeat the forces of the Druj and to re-establish the divine order of Asha. After more than a year of constant warfare, the last of the rebellions was finally extinguished. The empire was once again at peace, but it was a peace that had been won at a terrible cost. Darius had saved the Achaemenid Empire from implosion. He had proven himself to be a brilliant and ruthless military commander. But he knew that an empire could not be held together indefinitely by force alone. The great challenge now was to rebuild, to reorganize, to create a system of governance so efficient, so just, and so stable that the peoples of his vast realm would have no desire to rebel again. The warrior had won his throne. Now, the great administrator, the man who would be remembered by later generations as the shopkeeper, the great organizer of the Persian Empire, could finally begin his true work. With the last of the great rebellions finally extinguished, Darius I, now the undisputed master of the vast Achaemenid realm, turned his considerable genius from the arts of war to the even more complex arts of governance. He had saved the empire from implosion through his military prowess. Now, he would secure its future through his administrative brilliance. He understood, with a profound and pragmatic wisdom, that a great and diverse empire required more than just a strong hand at its center. It needed a nervous system, a set of arteries and veins that would allow for the smooth flow of communication, of commerce, and of authority to its most distant corners. He would be the great architect of this system, the man who would transform a patchwork of conquered territories into the most sophisticated and well-organized state the world had ever seen. His first and most important reform was the division of the empire into approximately 20 great provinces, or satrapies. Each of these vast territories, often corresponding to a former kingdom or a distinct cultural region, was to be governed by a satrap, a title that meant protector of the kingdom. These satraps, who were typically powerful Persian or Median nobles appointed directly by the king, were responsible for collecting taxes, administering justice, and maintaining order within their province. But Darius, keenly aware of the dangers of allowing too much power to accumulate in the hands of any single official, created a brilliant system of checks and balances. Within each province, he appointed a separate military commander, who was responsible for the local garrisons and who reported not to the satrap, but directly back to the king himself. And alongside these two powerful figures, he placed a third, an imperial secretary, a royal scribe whose job it was to monitor the affairs of the province and to also report directly back to the throne. This clever division of civil, military, and financial authority made it nearly impossible for a single ambitious satrap to raise a rebellion in secret. And to ensure the loyalty and the proper conduct of these powerful officials, Darius created a network of royal inspectors, men who came to be known as the eyes and ears of the king. Imagine these men, moving quietly and often unannounced throughout the vast empire. They were the king's personal representatives, with the full authority to investigate complaints, to audit treasury accounts, and to correct any abuses of power they might find. Their very existence was a constant reminder to the satraps that even in the most distant provinces, the authority of the great king was always present, always watching. To further unify his vast and diverse realm, Darius introduced the first standardized imperial coinage, a move that would revolutionize commerce across 3 continents. He created the golden dairic and the silver seglos, coins that were minted with a remarkable consistency of weight and purity. And on each coin was a single, powerful image, the great king himself, depicted as a heroic archer. Now, for the first time, a merchant in Egypt could trade with a merchant in Bactria using the same, reliable currency, its value guaranteed by the authority of the king whose image it bore. This system not only facilitated trade, but it also became a powerful tool of propaganda, carrying the image of the king's power and authority into every marketplace and every household, from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River. But perhaps the most magnificent and enduring of all of Darius's great reforms was the construction of the royal road. This was more than just a road, it was the great central artery of the empire. Imagine a great highway, stretching for over 1,500 miles, from the city of Sardis in western Anatolia all the way to the imperial capital of Susa in the Persian heartland. It was a marvel of ancient engineering, a well-maintained road that featured regularly spaced rest stations and bridges over all the major rivers. At these stations, which were placed approximately a day's ride apart, a system of mounted couriers, a kind of continental pony express, was established. A royal messenger could arrive at a station, and a fresh horse would be waiting, allowing him to carry his message onward with incredible speed. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled at the efficiency of this system. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night, he wrote with admiration, prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with the utmost speed. This remarkable communication network allowed the central government to receive intelligence and to transmit commands across the entire empire in less than 2 weeks, a feat of administrative control that was unparalleled in the ancient world. And finally, to provide a ceremonial and spiritual heart for his great, reorganized empire, Darius began the construction of a magnificent new capital at a place the Greeks would call Persepolis. Built upon a grand, man-made terrace with a commanding view of the surrounding plain, Persepolis was not designed to be an administrative center, but a great, ritual space, a place where the power, the wealth, and the harmonious diversity of the empire could be displayed for all the world to see. Its most striking feature was the great audience hall, the Apodana, its roof supported by a forest of 72 towering columns. And along the grand staircases that led to this hall, sculptors carved a magnificent and beautiful series of reliefs. These carvings depict a great, formal procession of representatives from all 23 of the subject nations of the empire, each delegation dressed in its distinctive native costume, each one bearing the characteristic products of its own region as a gift to the great king. There are Bactrians with their camels, Lydians carrying beautiful, intricate armlets, Ethiopians bringing elephant tusks, and Indians with vessels of gold dust. Unlike the brutal palace reliefs of the Assyrians, which glorified conquest and the suffering of the defeated, the reliefs of Persepolis present a very different vision of empire. Here, the diverse peoples of the realm are not shown as vanquished enemies, but as willing and dignified participants in a great, harmonious, and unified imperial project. Through these great and visionary reforms, the creation of the satrapies, the royal road, the standardized coinage, and the construction of the magnificent ceremonial capital at Persepolis, Darius the Great, the man who was sometimes derisively called the shopkeeper for his focus on administration and commerce, did something just as remarkable as the great conquests of his predecessor, Cyrus. He took a vast and chaotic collection of conquered lands and he gave it a structure, a nervous system, and a heart. He transformed it from a simple conquest state into a true, functioning, and enduring empire, an empire whose sophisticated systems of governance would become a model for all the great empires that were to follow. With his empire now secure, his administration organized, and his treasury overflowing with the tribute of 100 different nations, the great king, Darius, ruled over a world of apparent peace and stability. The Pax Persica, the Persian peace, extended across a vast portion of the known world. From the grand ceremonial capital at Persepolis, the will of the king, carried by swift messengers along the royal road, brought a unified order to a realm of immense diversity. But on the far western edge of this great empire, along the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean Sea, lived a people who did not easily bend to the logic of imperial rule. These were the Ionian Greeks, their cities perched on the coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Though they were now subjects of the Persian Empire, they had never forgotten their cultural connection to the Greek mainland, and a restless, independent spirit still smoldered in their hearts. In the year 499 BCE, this smoldering ember burst into flame. Led by Aristagoras, the ambitious tyrant of the city of Miletus, the Ionian Greek cities rose up in a coordinated revolt against Persian rule. It was a daring, almost foolhardy, act. They sought aid from their kinsmen across the sea, on the Greek mainland. Sparta, the great military power, prudently refused to get involved in such a distant and risky venture. But the young and idealistic democracy of Athens, eager to demonstrate its commitment to the cause of Greek liberty, made a fateful decision. They sent a contingent of 20 ships to support the rebellion. The small city of Eretria contributed 5 more. It was a small force, a gesture of solidarity, but it was an act that would have consequences far beyond anything the Athenians could have imagined. The combined Athenian and Ionian forces achieved a stunning early success. They marched inland and captured the city of Sardis, the wealthy capital of the Persian satrapy of Lydia. During the chaotic occupation, a fire broke out, and the great city, with its ancient temples and its rich markets, was burned to the ground. When the news of the burning of Sardis reached Darius in his distant capital, his reaction was not one of mere anger, it was one of profound and cold fury. That these insignificant, upstart Athenians had dared to aid his rebellious subjects and had burned one of his great cities was an unforgivable insult to his imperial majesty. According to Herodotus, he asked who these Athenians were. And upon being told, he took up his bow, shot an arrow into the sky, and made a prayer to his god, Ahura Mazda, that he might be granted the opportunity to take vengeance upon them. And from that day forward, he instructed a servant to whisper in his ear 3 times at every meal, a single, constant reminder, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed with a brutal and systematic efficiency. But Darius did not forget his vow. His first punitive expedition against mainland Greece, however, ended in disaster when a violent storm wrecked much of his fleet off the treacherous coast of Mount Athos. Undeterred, he prepared a second, larger force. His heralds traveled throughout Greece, demanding earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission to the Persian king. Many smaller city-states, terrified of the empire's might, complied. But Athens and Sparta not only refused, they executed the Persian messengers, a shocking violation of diplomatic custom that made a great war now seem inevitable. In the summer of 490 BCE, a great Persian armada, a fleet of hundreds of ships carrying a formidable army of infantry and cavalry, landed at the Bay of Marathon, a coastal plain just 26 miles from the city of Athens itself. The Persian plan was simple: to draw the Athenian army out of their city and crush them on the open plain, where the superior Persian cavalry could be used to its full effect. What followed was a battle that would enter the realm of legend, a victory so stunning, so improbable, that it would change the way the Greeks saw themselves, and the way the world saw the Greeks, forever. Against what seemed like overwhelming odds, a much smaller Athenian army, composed of citizen soldiers known as hoplites, marched out to meet the invaders. For several days, the two armies faced each other across the plain, a tense and watchful stalemate. But the Athenians, led by their brilliant general, Miltiades, knew that they could not win a prolonged battle of attrition. They had to take a great risk. They decided to attack. Imagine the scene. The Athenian army, some 10,000 strong, formed up in their traditional phalanx formation. But Miltiades, in a stroke of tactical genius, deliberately weakened his center and reinforced his flanks. And then, he gave the order to charge. The Greek hoplites, in their heavy bronze armor, carrying their great round shields and their long spears, began to run across the nearly 1 mile distance that separated the two armies. The Persians, seeing this, thought the Athenians had been seized by a suicidal madness. They were a small force, with no cavalry and no archers, charging headlong at a much larger army. As the two forces clashed, the weakened Athenian center, as planned, began to give way. But the strengthened Athenian flanks overwhelmed their Persian counterparts, and then, in a perfectly executed maneuver, they wheeled inward, enveloping the Persian center, which had been drawn forward into the trap. The Persian army, caught on three sides, their lines broken, their superior numbers now a disadvantage in the tight, chaotic melee, finally broke and fled in a panicked rout back toward their ships. The invincible imperial army had been shattered by a small force of citizen soldiers. According to Herodotus, a messenger, Phidippides, ran the entire 26 miles back to Athens, gasped out the news of the great victory, and then collapsed and died, bequeathing to posterity the Marathon race. The defeat at Marathon was a profound humiliation for the Persian Empire. But to Darius, this setback merely postponed the inevitable. It strengthened his resolve. He immediately began preparations for a third, even larger invasion, a force so vast it would overwhelm any possible Greek resistance. Death, however, would interrupt his plans. And the great task of avenging the honor of Persia, of finally extinguishing the troublesome flame of Greek freedom, would be left to his son and successor, Xerxes. The shadow of Marathon now hung over the Aegean world, a long and dark shadow that promised a future of even greater and more terrible conflict. In the year 486 before the Common Era, as the great King Darius lay on his deathbed, his final thoughts were not of the vast and prosperous empire he had built, but of the small, stinging humiliation he had suffered at the hands of the Athenians on the plains of Marathon. The task of avenging this slight, of restoring the unquestioned authority of the Persian Empire, now fell to his son and successor, a man whose name would become synonymous with overwhelming power and immense ambition, Xerxes I. Xerxes was a man born in the purple, the first heir to be born after his father had become the king of kings. He inherited not just an empire, but a legacy of greatness that he felt a profound and heavy obligation to uphold, and perhaps, to surpass. He was tall, handsome, and possessed of a restless energy. And in his heart, the unfinished business of Marathon burned like a slow, hot fire. He saw the defeat not just as a military setback, but as a stain upon the honor of his father and a challenge to the very principle of the cosmic order that his dynasty represented. The small, fractious cities of Greece, with their strange and chaotic ideas of democracy, had dared to defy the will of the world's rightful sovereign. This was not merely a political matter, it was a form of cosmic insolence, a manifestation of the druj, the lie, that had to be extinguished by the overwhelming power of Asha, the truth. For the first few years of his reign, Xerxes was occupied with suppressing rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, securing the foundations of the empire he had inherited. But all the while, the great project, the grand design for the punishment of Greece, was taking shape in his mind. This would not be another punitive expedition like the one that had failed at Marathon. This would be an invasion of such immense, such overwhelming scale, that the very memory of Greek resistance would be erased from the earth. He would assemble a force so vast that it would not resemble an army, but a force of nature, a human tidal wave that would sweep over the Greek peninsula and extinguish its troublesome flame of freedom forever. For 4 long years, the entire Persian Empire, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, was transformed into a great and terrible war machine. The preparations were on a scale that beggared the imagination. Royal heralds were dispatched to every corner of the vast realm, to every satrapy and every subject nation, with the royal command to levy troops. And from every corner of the known world, the soldiers came. Imagine the scene at the great mustering grounds. There were the Persians themselves, the elite infantry, with their brightly colored tunics and their scale armor, carrying their great wicker shields and their deadly short spears. There were the Medes, their kinsmen, famed for their skill as horsemen. There were the Assyrians from the heart of Mesopotamia, with their bronze helmets and their iron-tipped clubs. There were the Bactrians from the far eastern frontier, with their short bows. There were the Indians, dressed in cotton, carrying cane bows that fired iron-tipped arrows. There were the Ethiopians from the deep south, their bodies painted half white and half red, cloaked in the skins of leopards and lions, their arrows tipped not with iron, but with sharpened stone. There were the Scythians, the nomadic horsemen from the great steppes, and the Arabs on their swift camels. It was a magnificent and terrifying tapestry of humanity, a living embodiment of the empire's immense diversity and its absolute power, all of it now united in a single, terrible purpose. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his Awe, estimated the land army alone to number over 1.7 million men. While modern historians believe this number to be an exaggeration, there is no doubt that it was the largest and most diverse army the world had ever seen. And to support this great land army, a vast fleet was assembled. The skilled Phoenician sailors, the Greek mariners of Ionia, the Egyptians with their river craft, all were commanded to build and to man a fleet of over 1,200 triremes, the great warships of the age, and thousands of smaller supply vessels. The sea itself, it seemed, was being bent to the will of the great king. But Xerxes's ambition was not limited to assembling a great army and navy. He sought to command nature itself. He remembered the fate of the first expedition, which had been wrecked by a storm off the treacherous coast of the Mount Athos Peninsula. He was determined that this would not happen again. And so, he ordered one of the most audacious engineering feats of the ancient world. For 3 years, his engineers and thousands of laborers worked to dig a great canal, over a mile long, straight through the base of the Athos Peninsula, wide enough for 2 triremes to pass abreast. He would not sail his fleet around the dangerous mountain, he would make the mountain move for his fleet. And then there was the challenge of crossing the Hellespont, the strait that separated Asia from Europe. To march his great army across, he commanded the construction of 2 magnificent pontoon bridges, a mile long, spanning the water from shore to shore. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of ships, triremes and pentaconters, were lashed together side by side, anchored against the strong currents. Great flax and papyrus cables, of an immense thickness, were stretched across their decks. And upon these cables, a solid wooden roadway was laid, packed with earth and brushwood, with high railings on either side so that the baggage animals would not be frightened by the sight of the sea below. When the first bridge was completed, a great storm arose and smashed it to pieces. Xerxes, in a famous display of royal fury and hubris, is said to have ordered the Hellespont itself to be punished. His soldiers gave the water 300 lashes with a whip, and they dropped a pair of shackles into the sea, while the king's men shouted curses at it. "You bitter water," they cried, "your master lays this punishment upon you for doing him wrong, who never did you any wrong." He then had the engineers who had built the bridge beheaded, and he ordered a new, stronger bridge to be built. Finally, after 4 years of immense preparation, the great host was assembled. The canal was complete. The new bridge stood firm. And in the spring of 480 BCE, the great invasion began. Xerxes himself, seated upon a great white marble throne that had been carved for him on a hillside overlooking the Hellespont, watched as his army began its crossing. For 7 days and 7 nights, without pause, the river of humanity flowed across the bridge of boats, from Asia into Europe. The air was filled with the sound of 100 different languages, with the trampling of 1,000,000 feet, with the scent of burning incense from the altars that had been set up along the shore. It was the greatest movement of people the world had ever witnessed, a spectacle of such overwhelming power and majesty that it seemed as if the very gods themselves must be in awe. The great king had unleashed his vengeance. The human tidal wave was now in motion, its destination the small, distant, and seemingly insignificant land of Greece. The shadow of Marathon was about to be answered with a storm of fire and steel. The assassination of the great king, Xerxes, in the year 465 before the Common Era, marked a subtle but profound turning point in the history of the Achaemenid Empire. Though the realm would continue for another century and a quarter, maintaining its vast territorial extent and its sophisticated administrative systems, the brilliant, confident, and expansionist energy of its early years began to fade, replaced by a more cautious, more defensive, and more insular posture. The story of this long decline unfolds not as a dramatic, sudden collapse, but as a slow, gradual erosion of the very foundations that had once made the empire so remarkably stable and effective. The new king, Artaxerxes I, who took the throne after eliminating his father's assassins, inherited an empire that was still, by any measure, at the height of its material prosperity. The great imperial treasuries remained full, the vast provinces were, for the most part, quiet, and the administrative systems established by his grandfather, Darius the Great, continued to function effectively. Yet, challenges, both external and internal, would test the new sovereign's abilities and reveal the growing structural weaknesses of his vast realm. In the far western province of Egypt, always one of the most restive and proud of the empire's territories, a great rebellion broke out, led by a local Libyan leader named Inaros. And this rebellion received significant military support from Athens, the great naval power that was now building its own maritime empire in the eastern Mediterranean. The Athenians, emboldened by their earlier victories against Xerxes, saw a great opportunity to destabilize Persian authority in this immensely wealthy and strategic province. Though this Egyptian revolt was eventually, after years of difficult fighting, suppressed by Persian forces, it revealed two troubling new realities: the persistence of provincial discontent, and the growing ambition of Athens as a rival imperial power. Artaxerxes and his successors responded to this new strategic reality with a sophisticated and cynical diplomatic strategy. They recognized that another costly, direct military assault on mainland Greece was a risky and perhaps unwinnable proposition. And so, they began to employ a new and far more effective weapon: Persian gold. They learned to play the Greek city-states against each other, to exploit their ancient and bitter rivalries, and to use their immense wealth to achieve their strategic objectives without shedding a drop of Persian blood. During the Great Peloponnesian War, the long and ruinous conflict between Athens and Sparta, Persian diplomats and Persian gold provided crucial support to the Spartan cause. This financial aid helped to fund the Spartan fleet that would eventually defeat the Athenians, thus eliminating, for a time, the primary naval threat to Persian interests in the Aegean. This sophisticated foreign policy, using wealth and diplomacy rather than direct military force, would characterize the empire's engagement with the Greek world for the next century. But while the empire's external policies displayed a new and subtle brilliance, its internal politics were growing increasingly complex and dangerous. The court life in the great capitals of Susa and Persepolis grew more insular and ceremonial. Access to the sovereign became more and more restricted, with elaborate court protocols governing who could approach the throne. The great king, once a leader who had shared the hardships of the campaign trail with his soldiers, now became an increasingly remote and almost divine figure, his true thoughts and intentions filtered through a complex and often treacherous web of palace officials. The royal harem, with its powerful queen mothers, its ambitious royal wives, and its hundreds of concubines, became a hotbed of political intrigue, its factions often playing a decisive role in the secret and often bloody politics of royal succession. And the eunuch chamberlains, the men who controlled all personal access to the increasingly isolated monarch, accumulated immense and often corrupt behind-the-scenes power. This growing isolation of the sovereign from direct contact with his subjects and his empire created a profound governance challenge. The information that reached the throne was now increasingly filtered through multiple intermediaries, each with their own agenda, a situation that sometimes distorted the king's understanding of the realities in his distant provinces. When Artaxerxes I died in 424 BCE after a long reign of 41 years, a brief but violent succession struggle ensued. His son, Xerxes II, held the throne for just 45 days before being assassinated by his half-brother, Sogdianus, who himself ruled for only 6 months before being overthrown by another half-brother, who took the throne as Darius II. This unstable and bloody transition revealed a dangerous weakening in the mechanisms for an orderly succession. The reign of Darius II saw the continuation of these troubling trends. While the empire maintained its outward stability, the power of the great satraps, the governors of the distant provinces, continued to grow. In western Anatolia, the satraps Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus pursued semi-independent policies, at times cooperating with the central government, and at other times acting on their own initiative, their personal rivalry often taking precedence over the interests of the empire. And the court intrigues intensified. The queen, Perisides, wielded enormous influence, particularly in the matter of the royal succession. Her favorite son was not the crown prince, Arses, but his ambitious and charismatic younger brother, Cyrus the Younger. And she used her influence to have her favorite son appointed as the supreme commander in all of western Anatolia, giving him access to immense military and financial resources. This fateful appointment would have terrible consequences when Darius II died in the year 404 BCE. Arses took the throne as Artaxerxes II. But his younger brother, Cyrus, immediately began plotting a rebellion. Drawing on his immense personal wealth and his strong connections with the Greek world, he assembled a great army, which included, most famously, a contingent of over 10,000 Greek mercenaries, professional heavy infantrymen who were considered the finest soldiers of their age. With this powerful force, he marched into the heart of the Persian Empire, intending to seize the throne from his brother. The two brothers and their armies met at the Battle of Cunaxa, near Babylon, in 401 BCE. The battle itself was a tactical success for the rebels. Their Greek mercenaries easily routed the forces opposite them. But in a moment of rash, heroic courage, Cyrus himself charged directly at his brother's position and was killed in the fighting. Without their leader, his cause collapsed instantly. The rebellion was over, but its consequences were profound. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries now found themselves stranded, deep in the heart of a hostile empire. Their long and famous fighting retreat northward, through thousands of miles of difficult terrain, an epic journey immortalized in the Anabasis of Xenophon, one of their commanders, became a legend in the Greek world. But it also revealed to the Greeks the immense scale, but also the potential vulnerabilities, of the great Persian Empire. In the long reign of Artaxerxes II that followed, the empire continued its slow, graceful, but undeniable decline. Egypt, always the most restive of the provinces, once again broke away, regaining its independence for a period of 60 years. A great satraps revolt saw multiple provincial governors in Anatolia coordinate their rebellion against the central authority. And though this revolt eventually collapsed due to the governor's own internal rivalries, it demonstrated the ever-weakening grip of the central government over its distant territories. There was a brief and violent resurgence of imperial power under the next king, Artaxerxes III, who took the throne in 358 BCE. He was a man of great energy and profound ruthlessness. He began his reign by executing numerous potential rivals within the royal family to secure his position. He then turned his full attention to the problem of Egypt, and after several failed attempts, he personally led a massive campaign in 343 BCE that finally reconquered the wealthy province, ending its 60 years of independence and demonstrating that the Persian military, when properly led, was still a formidable force. But this was to be the final, brilliant flare of a dying star. The structural weaknesses of the empire were now too deep to be permanently fixed. The reliance on foreign mercenaries had drained the treasury and created a military force with no inherent loyalty to the state. The great satraps ruled their provinces like virtual kings. And the court at the center of the empire was a nest of deadly intrigue. In 338 BCE, Artaxerxes III himself fell victim to a palace conspiracy, poisoned by his powerful eunuch, Bagoas, who then placed the king's youngest son on the throne as a puppet. When this new, young king attempted to assert his own independence, Bagoas poisoned him as well, and elevated a distant cousin of the royal line to the throne. This was the man who would be the last of his great dynasty. He took the throne as Darius III. He was a brave and capable man, and he quickly eliminated the treacherous Bagoas to establish his own independent authority. But he had inherited a vast, powerful, but deeply troubled empire, an empire whose foundations were slowly crumbling from within. And he had come to the throne at precisely the moment that a new and terrible threat was emerging from the west, from the small, mountainous kingdom of Macedon. He did not know it yet, but as he sat upon the great throne of Cyrus and his namesake Darius the Great, a storm was gathering, a storm that would be led by a young king named Alexander, a storm that would sweep away his empire and change the world forever. In the spring of the year 334 before the Common Era, a young king from the northern fringes of the Greek world, from the rugged, mountainous kingdom of Macedon, crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia. He was just 22 years of age. His name was Alexander. And the army he commanded, a force of approximately 40,000 men, while formidable, well-disciplined, and forged into a revolutionary fighting machine by his father, Philip II, still represented just a fraction of the immense military resources theoretically available to the great Persian Empire. Few observers at the time, even the most astute, could have predicted that within 4 short years, this young Macedonian would topple the most extensive and powerful empire the world had yet known. The empire that Alexander confronted was not at the height of its powers. Decades of declining administrative effectiveness, of financial strain, and of the growing autonomy of its powerful satraps had eroded the central authority that had once been the empire's greatest strength. And the new king, Darius III, had only recently secured his position on the throne, having come to power not through a smooth succession, but through the bloody and treacherous intrigues of the palace eunuch, Bagoas. Though Darius had quickly eliminated Bagoas and established his own authority, he had had little time to consolidate the support of the great noble families or to address the deep structural weaknesses of his vast realm. The great empire was vulnerable. But the decisive factor in this final, great confrontation was the character of the invader himself. Alexander was no ordinary opponent. He was a military commander of singular, almost supernatural, talent, leading a revolutionary military organization. He had been trained since childhood in the arts of war and had been raised on the great epic tales of the Greek heroes, particularly his supposed ancestor, Achilles. He brought to his great Eastern campaign not just tactical genius, but a boundless, almost manic, ambition, a profound belief in his own divinely ordained destiny. The first major confrontation between the two worlds came at the Granicus River, shortly after Alexander's landing in Anatolia. Here, the local Persian satraps had assembled a formidable army, which included many Greek mercenaries, to challenge the invaders. The battle that followed nearly ended Alexander's campaign before it had properly begun. During the initial, chaotic cavalry engagement, the young Macedonian king was struck a potentially lethal blow to his helmet and was saved only by the timely intervention of one of his loyal commanders. Having survived this close call, Alexander's forces ultimately prevailed, not through superior numbers, but through their superior tactical coordination. The imperial army, composed of different contingents under different commanders, with no single, unified leadership on the field, could not match the integrated, combined arms approach of the Macedonian war machine. Following this first victory, Alexander made a brilliant and strategically significant choice. He did not push directly inland, toward the imperial heartland. Instead, he turned his army south, marching along the Anatolian coast, systematically reducing the great coastal cities and eliminating the Persian naval bases one by one. This masterful strategy effectively neutralized the substantial Persian fleet, which could have posed a decisive threat to his supply lines, by depriving it of any friendly ports in the Aegean. By the summer of the year 333, Alexander had secured the western coast of Anatolia and had begun to move eastward into Cilicia. Darius III, now recognizing the profound seriousness of the threat, had used the intervening months to assemble a great imperial army, drawing troops from across the empire, to meet the invader. The two forces met on a narrow coastal plain at Issus. This constricted battlefield, like the pass at Thermopylae long before, negated much of the Persian numerical advantage, allowing Alexander's more disciplined troops to maintain their formation against a superior force. The Macedonian king, in a move that would become his signature tactic, personally led his elite companion cavalry in a decisive, wedge-shaped charge aimed directly at the center of the Persian line, where Darius himself commanded his army from a great war chariot. As the Macedonian horsemen broke through the Persian lines, their charge directed like an arrow at the heart of the imperial command, Darius, seeing his own personal safety threatened, chose to flee the battlefield. His departure, while perhaps strategically sound in the long term, triggered a general collapse of the imperial army, which dissolved into a panicked rout. The Persian camp, the royal family, including Darius's mother, his wife, and his children, and the immense royal treasury all fell into Alexander's hands. Once again, Alexander demonstrated a political astuteness that was as brilliant as his military genius. He treated the captured royal women with the utmost respect and honor, a chivalrous act that portrayed him not as a barbarian raider, but as a legitimate and civilized sovereign. And once again, he made a puzzling strategic choice. Instead of pursuing the defeated Darius immediately into the Persian heartland, he turned his army south once more, this time toward the ancient lands of Phoenicia and Egypt. By securing the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, he would eliminate any final threat from the Persian navy. And by taking Egypt, the wealthiest province of the empire, he would not only secure immense resources for his campaign, but he could also gain a profound legitimacy by presenting himself as the successor to the ancient pharaohs. The great Phoenician island city of Tyre resisted him, and he was forced into a long and difficult 7-month siege. He built a massive causeway from the mainland to the island, a monumental feat of engineering, and eventually took the city by storm, his treatment of its defenders a brutal warning of the consequences of defiance. After Tyre, he entered Egypt, where he was met with virtually no resistance. The Egyptians, who had only recently been reconquered by the Persians, welcomed him as a liberator. And the powerful priests of the god Ammonius recognized him as a true pharaoh, the son of the god himself, further cementing his growing, almost divine, authority. By the spring of 331 BCE, Alexander had consolidated his control of the entire western portion of the empire. He now turned his attention to the final confrontation. Darius had used the intervening year and a half to assemble another, even larger army, drawn from the great eastern provinces of the empire. He had learned the lessons of Issus. He would not allow Alexander to fight him in a narrow, constricted space. He chose the battlefield himself, the wide, open plains of Gaugamela, in northern Mesopotamia, a perfect field for his superior numbers in cavalry and his fearsome scythed chariots. On the morning of October 1, 331 BCE, the two armies faced each other across the plain. The battle that followed was Alexander's masterpiece, the culmination of his tactical genius. The Persian army, vastly outnumbering the Macedonians, extended far beyond their lines, threatening to envelop them completely. Alexander advanced his own line at an angle, a seemingly strange maneuver that drew the Persian left wing further out, eventually creating a small gap in the center of their formation. Seizing this fleeting opportunity, Alexander led his companion cavalry in another devastating charge, aimed once again directly at the position of Darius himself. And once again, as the Macedonian charge broke through toward his war chariot, the last Achaemenid king chose to flee, his departure triggering another catastrophic collapse of the imperial army. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. The military power of the Persian Empire was broken forever. After his final defeat, Darius fled eastward, hoping to rally yet another army in the remote provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana. But his authority had evaporated. He was now a king with no kingdom. He was arrested, and then, as Alexander's vanguard drew near, he was murdered by his own subordinates, by the satrap Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the new king. Alexander, upon finding the body of the last Persian king dying by the roadside, in a final, brilliant act of political theater, covered the dead sovereign with his own cloak and ordered him to be given a royal burial with full imperial honors at Persepolis. He would now present himself not as the conqueror of the Persian Empire, but as the legitimate avenger of its last king, the rightful successor to the great Achaemenid tradition. The great empire, which had been founded by the visionary Cyrus, which had been given its enduring form by the genius of Darius, which had once stretched from the Indus to the Danube, was no more. But its legacy was not one of simple defeat. The administrative systems it had created were so effective that Alexander and his own successors would adopt them. The cultural and artistic synthesis it had fostered would continue to influence the world for centuries to come. And its revolutionary vision of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and unified world, a world held together not just by force, but by a surprising and pragmatic tolerance, would remain an ideal, an echo of a great and noble dream, a quiet and profound whisper on the winds of history. As the flames subsided over the magnificent, smoking ruins of Persepolis, a great chapter in the human story came to a close. The empire had fallen. But the world it had created, a world connected, a world transformed, would endure. And as you now drift into the deepest realms of your own sleep, let the memory of this ancient, magnificent, and complex empire find its own quiet peace. The kings are gone. The armies are dust. But the idea of a world united, a world of many peoples living together under a single, benevolent sky, remains a powerful and enduring dream. Rest now.